Day 47. Port Hawkesbury to Sydney. I woke up early to the sounds of a grass trimmer nearby. Like always, I had to take a piss right away. As I gathered myself, I noticed a landscaper close by. Not wanting to get into any issues with Walmart, I quickly hopped into the front seat, fired up my beast, and left. I'm certain the landscaper knew that I was car camping, given where I parked and my British Columbia license plates. Regardless, I was on my way. I stopped by the Tim Hortons to get my daily dose of vitamin C with 2 creams and 2 sugars, as I normally did, and headed northwest on Highway 105 after leaving Port Hawkesbury. It was still very early in the morning and the roads were empty. The drive through the interior of Cape Breton Island was beautiful, and the roads were in good condition. After a short period of time, I reached Waikokoma, which placed me right by the Bras d'Or Lake. I continued northeast until I reached Badek, where the Alexander Graham Bell National Historic Site was. I wasn't actually planning on visiting this museum, but I stopped here anyways. Even if it wasn't closed due to the restrictions, it was so early in the morning it was closed anyways. I continued driving until I reached St. Anne's, which was the beginning of the world-famous Cabot Trail. At the beginning of the Cabot Trail, I pulled over after the bridge to take some pictures. It was still very early and the sun had only broken over the horizon for a short period of time. But the true majestic beauty of Cape Breton Island was coming out for me to see. I took a few pictures and continued onwards. I passed by the Gaelic College, another world-famous place on Cape Breton Island and one of the few remaining Gaelic educational institutions outside of the United Kingdom. I drove for some time until I saw what appeared to be a hairpin turn climbing sharply over the cliff. Signage also indicated that it was a tight corner with a steep ascent. I'd have to keep my beast in low gear, but I also thought of how awesome this would be to take on a motorcycle. Perhaps in the future I might do a motorcycle trip across the country as well. But for now, it was just my beast and I traveling together on the Cabot Trail. I ripped around a corner quite quickly, trying to see the limits of my beast while she pulled in second gear up the steep road. When we reached the top, we were greeted by beautiful views all around. This was the Pathen Brook Lookout, overseeing the Atlantic Ocean. Far in the distance was Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, as well as Newfoundland. I took a short video as this is one of the many famous lookout points along the world-famous Cabot Trail. The roads were still barren at the time as it was barely 7 o'clock, and with restrictions, who knew how many people would be around. I headed back to my beast as it was actually quite windy up on the cliff, and continued to drive down until I reached Ingonish Harbor not too far away. Here was another quaint little community along the coast, where the fishing industry has died and been replaced with tourism. With the pandemic and restrictions, I could imagine the community had been suffering, but then again, everyone else has been. I passed by the ski Cape Smoky, a ski hill which had turned into new ownership and was being reconstructed at the time. Eventually, I reached the Cape Breton Highlands National Park. Prior to beginning my cross-country road trip, I purchased an annual pass which allowed me to gain access to all the national parks across Canada. I stopped in the Ingonish Visitor Center to use a washroom and get acquainted with the region. This was the first time in my life I've ever been out here, and definitely the furthest east in Canada I have been so far. The thrill of adventure coursed through me as I knew this would be another memorable experience that I would remember for the remainder of my life. Wanting to explore the terrain on foot, I decided to take a scenic hike to Middlehead Trail. This was just a short drive down the road, right by Celtic Lodge. Looking at the Celtic Lodge, I knew that the resort was hurting due to the pandemic, but I could also imagine how busy it would have been under normal circumstances. The resort was widely regarded as the most beautiful resort in Atlantic Canada. The Middlehead Trail juts out onto the eastern side of Cape Breton Island facing the Atlantic Ocean. The current weather was overcast, so it wasn't as sunny as I would like it to be. But no matter, it was still a beautiful day and I would make the most out of it. I followed the trail as it meandered through the forest and followed the cliff. The trail itself was well maintained, so there was no possibility of being lost. Several plaques were strategically placed along the trail to show its history and importance to the area. It was great to be out in nature again, and to enjoy my first day here on Cape Breton Island. The Middlehead Trail was facing the Atlantic Ocean, and I could only imagine that in the distance, the far distance, was Europe. The waters were clear and calm. Surprisingly, there were no boats anywhere. The rocky terrain was so rugged and raw, untouched by development and industry. Being here was truly an escape. The trees would sway with the strong winds coming off the ocean. When I reached clearings, I would see the tall grass move with the wind gusts, reminding me that I was just an organism in the midst of nature's forces. While there were others on the trail, it certainly wasn't busy, so I was able to enjoy the experience returning to nature. There were purpose-built barriers in certain locations, as venturing further past these barriers meant traversing through dangerous areas that could have easily led to death. The elevation changed throughout the hike, but it was gradual, so nothing that I would have found difficult. I did manage to peer over the cliffs a few times, and even traversed off trail to an area that I wasn't supposed to be in. But given that no one knew that I was no longer in Victoria, let alone all the way on Cape Breton Island, I knew that I could not perish, so I decided to remain on the cautious side. The waves battered the rocks down below, reminding me that the ocean has a force that humans could never control. Looking at the rocky cliffs, I thought of how this would have once been covered by an ice sheet, and perhaps even be at the bottom of the ocean millions of years ago. Given how beautiful this area was, I was really surprised that the Cape Breton Highlands National Park wasn't as busy or as famous as places like Banff National Park. Banff had the mountains and the beautiful lakes. Cape Breton Highlands National Park had the ocean and the cliffs. But again, the backdrop of Alberta, one of the wealthiest provinces in Canada, had far better infrastructure compared to Nova Scotia, one of the poorest provinces in Canada. Everything around me during this moment I wanted to freeze in time. Here I was, back in my home province, back in nature, feeling the breeze around me and enjoying the ocean with the sounds of the waves at my feet. I continued hiking the Middlehead Trail until I reached the end. At least the barrier prevented anyone from traversing further. It was a rocky outcrop into the Atlantic Ocean, and definitely something deadly should anyone have fallen down and into the cold waters below. Here I stood on one of the easternmost points of Cape Breton Highlands National Park, just around the bend from one of the most famous resorts in Atlantic Canada, the Celtic Lodge, and I was overlooking the cliffs above the Atlantic Ocean. All the sacrifices I made back in Victoria, which led me here, were well worth it. Since arriving in Atlantic Canada from Quebec not too long ago, I have been able to experience the Atlantic Ocean from the beaches to the cliffs. I was feeling peace with every moment I faced the ocean. I made my way back to my beast, enjoying the scenery of this easy hike. Upon returning, I fired up my beast and left the parking lot of the Celtic Lodge. However, just before leaving, I came up to a gray Sprinter-based RV with British Columbia plates. I stopped for a moment, rolled down my window, and spoke to the owner. It appeared that the owner was just about to embark on the same hike that I just finished, the Middlehead Trail. I was quite surprised to see someone with British Columbia plates this far east during the pandemic, as this was my first time during the whole entire trip I seen somebody from British Columbia in my home province. We spoke about our travels. It appeared that he had been on the road slightly longer than I have, with similar plans of exploring Atlantic Canada. He seemed quite surprised that I made it this far, stealth car camping, as he could see my pillow and blanket in the back seat of my vehicle, while he had a much more professional setup. We laughed about our encounters in Toronto, and while I truly enjoyed Toronto, he definitely did not enjoy his time there. We did, however, agree that Quebec City was a beautiful city and a must visit. I eventually bid the cross country traveler farewell as I continued onwards with my trek. A short drive north of the Middlehead Trail, I saw a young couple pulled over, petting a cow that was sticking its head out of the fence. I pulled over myself to take a picture. I didn't care to pet the cow as I had no experience with farm animals, and I knew that being bitten by something would definitely alter the course of my trip. Cruising along, I stopped at another incredible lookout point just north of Broad Cove. This lookout point was quite small and didn't house very many vehicles, but it was still a beautiful place to stop and take pictures. Amidst the rocky cliffs in the distance, I was able to see a beach completely uninhabited. This was not something I would normally find previous to the pandemic. I continued driving north, and again I found another beautiful lookout point. This was Lakey's Head. This was a much larger lookout point where more vehicles and larger vehicles could pull over and enjoy the views of the surrounding area. There were a number of plaques describing the marine life, the ecosystem, and the history of the area. There were large boulders emptying out into the ocean, and people enjoying climbing up and around these massive behemoths. I too took the opportunity to scramble across these massive rocks, playing like a child while feeling carefree. The endless sounds of the waves crashing against the rocks was like music to my ears, and the breeze of the ocean was calming. The weather was still slightly overcast, but I was loving every minute of this experience. Lakey's Head was one of the more popular lookout points as people could head down and hop along the boulders or just sit on the rocks and enjoy the views. While I wasn't planning on staying here long, I also imagined how this would have been a beautiful place to watch the sunset or the sunrise. I was certain that this would be a great opportunity for photographers. Everything that I had seen so far on Cape Breton Island had been absolutely stunning. While the mainland of Nova Scotia is very scenic and beautiful as well, Cape Breton Island was different, where it was just raw and rugged. Not underdeveloped, just undeveloped. This was a place where I was able to experience nature in its true form. The people of Cape Breton Island were very different from the people of mainland Nova Scotia, just like the people of Vancouver Island were very different from the people of mainland British Columbia. Nature, serenity, and community had much to do with the differences. I left my childish adventures on Lakey's Head and continued north until reaching a small community of Neil's Harbor. I was quite hungry and I looked for a place to eat. Everything was still closed as it was still quite early in the morning. Neil's Harbor had a lighthouse, but I decided I was too hungry to visit, and I wasn't quite interested in seeing any more lighthouses. A quick check on Google Maps led me to an area not too far away, where I stopped at a restaurant called Morrison's Restaurant. Unfortunately, it was closed, but another quick search led me to a new hiking trail, the Theodore Fricker Mountain Trail. Apparently, it was just a short drive down, so off I went. I parked in a parking lot across the street, and I was a little confused as to where the actual trail started. The parking lot was filled with rubbish, and it was quite disappointing to see how people would fly tip in such a beautiful area. When I finally discovered the proper trailhead, I began the trek. Distracted by the beauty of Cape Breton Island, I didn't consider that I should have brought water. The trail began in the forest with a couple of streams close by, but then it quickly gained elevation. The trail distance itself wasn't far, but once it started to go up, I found myself short of breath. The trail was well marked and well maintained, so getting lost was practically impossible. Given my extensive backcountry hiking experience, this was quite easy. But considering that I haven't been able to exercise like I normally did back in Victoria, I had significant difficulty ascending to the peak of this mountain. The mountain itself wasn't anything like what I've hiked back on the west coast. The elevation gain here was barely 300 meters. As I was ascending, the forest was starting to thin out and I could see views in the distance. By then I was struggling, reminding myself that I was quite stupid for not bringing any water and hiking on an empty stomach. I thought that this would be a quick hike with some views at the top to take up my time until I found a restaurant close by that was open. Along the way, I found a message scrawled onto a tree to keep going no matter how difficult it was. Whomever wrote this knew that this trail was much steeper than expected. Eventually, the forest cleared out and I was scrambling over loose rocks. The views were incredible even before I reached the top. All around me, there were so many vantage points to see the surrounding area. The wild forests in and around were so pretty with the lush green color emanating nature's vibrance. Eventually, I reached the top, and I looked over to see a Canadian flag in the distance. I was completely alone on the trail, and I should have walked over to the flag. Unfortunately, given my physical condition, I decided that it would be best to head down and return to my beast. This was Cape Breton Island in its raw splendor. I had to remind myself again that despite the pandemic and the unhappiness I felt in the past year working in Victoria, something incredible happened in the end. I was able to enjoy this once-in-a-lifetime cross-country road trip and visit areas of Canada I had never been to before. From the peak of the Theodore Fricker Mountain Trail, I could see the landscape in all directions. Cape Breton Island did not disappoint, and this was far more pristine than I could have imagined. This is where nature thrived. Frantically, I headed down the mountain as my body was giving out due to the combination of physical stress, no water, no food, and lack of exercise. Eventually, I made it to the bottom of the forest where the elevation leveled out, and I was nearing the beginning of the trail. I ran into a couple whom I spoke to briefly about the trail before heading back to my beast to consume what water I had left. Surprisingly, I completed the hike in just a little over an hour. Perhaps I wasn't that out of shape after all, but perhaps it was just out of sheer desperation to get water that I ran down this bloody mountain. After replenishing my body with water, I still needed to find a place to eat as my hunger was consuming me. I returned to Morrison's restaurant where I found that it was open now. I sat there by the window, enjoying my accomplishment and reflecting on how my day had been so far. I ordered the most expensive and largest meal available. While I tried to relax and savor my food, I was so ravenous I consumed everything rather quickly and rushed. I spoke to the waitress, who was surprised that I came all the way from British Columbia. After enjoying what was easily one of the best meals I had, I returned to my beast to continue exploring the Cabot Trail. Driving for some time and ascending higher into the mountains, I enjoyed the road so much with all of its twisties and turns, downshifting hard and leaning into the corners with my beast. No complaints here, she was able to endure everything and more. I also knew that this would be a wonderful place to take a motorcycle. I remembered the two bikers I met at the Fundy Trail Parkway a few weeks ago, who told me that the Cabot Trail was a must-do on a motorcycle, and they were definitely correct. I arrived at another of the many scenic lookout points a short drive after, the North Mountain Lookout. This lookout was just over the Aspy Fault, a fault line that cuts deep across Cape Breton Island. The tectonic activity created a valley throughout the millions of years of continuous movement. This valley was in a heavily forested area, which was only a small part of the Aspy Fault, which extended well past Cape Breton Island and as far as Newfoundland. I spent some time taking pictures and resting after a hot rip up this point in the mountain. The winds out here were calm, and the ocean was a distance away. But there were a number of hiking trails along the Aspy Fault that traversed into the valley below, but I decided to continue driving on. Eventually I reached Pleasant Bay, at the northwest corner of the Cape Breton Highlands National Park. I visited the Whale Interpretive Center, where I was greeted by a bilingual woman who managed the museum. She and I spoke about traveling, as I told her I was from Vancouver. She told me she actually lived in Vancouver during the 70s, and she found that she didn't fit so well living there. I myself told her that I never fit into Vancouver, being a Haligonian. We both agreed that the big city lights comes with big city problems, and a more peaceful community could be found in Atlantic Canada. She also told me about the numerous whale watching adventures and activities in and around Pleasant Bay, and how the community would come together to help each other in need. She also said how it was normal during weekends for everyone to gather at one person's home for a barbecue. This was a sense of community that I had longed for. Living in Halifax, Dartmouth, Sackville reminded me of how Atlantic Canadians were different. I yearned to return to this type of community. After speaking to her, I explored the museum, finding different displays of the various whales found not only around the world but within the waters surrounding Cape Breton Island. Some of these displays were mainly descriptive and were written by youth, which I thought was pretty cute. Some of the other displays were much more scientific. Little did I know that Pleasant Bay was one of the most premier whale watching areas of all of Canada. All around Cape Breton Highlands National Park were sightings of whales, but Pleasant Bay seemed to be perfectly set up to watch these magnificent creatures. I enjoyed my time here exploring, and after my mind was saturated with whale information, I bid the friendly lady farewell for now and returned to my beast. I continued driving for a short period of time, this time on the west coast of Cape Breton Island and heading south. In the distance I saw a restaurant, the Rusty Anchor, which I knew I had to stop by. I heard about this restaurant as one of the must-dine-at restaurants on Cape Breton Island by another well-established YouTube content creator. I pulled over, seeing as it was open, and I had a seat to myself. It was quite busy and I was enjoying the views. The restaurant was perched atop a cliff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. It was great to see that the restaurant was doing quite well despite the pandemic, and that people were traveling and exploring the Cape Breton Highlands National Park. I enjoyed a scrumptious seafood meal, the second of the day, as a treat to myself. The weather on this side of Cape Breton Island wasn't all that pleasant, and I could see the clouds rolling in. After having a delicious meal, I headed back to my beast and continued driving along the Cabot Trail. Shortly after, I reached a beautiful lookout point, the Mackenzie Mountain Lookout. Here I could see the rain in the distance as the weather began to sour. There were a number of plaques here as well, verifying what the friendly woman at the Whale Interpretive Center said earlier. This was the premier place for whale sightings. Like many of the views I seen earlier, the Aspy Fault and the valley that was created by it was lush with untouched forests. It was great to see that Canada had designated this beautiful landscape to be a national park and not have it used for commerce or industry. Despite the sour weather approaching, all around me was pristine wilderness. There were a number of hiking trails, but I thought that after the Theodore Fricker Mountain Trail this morning, I would be good for a while. Also, I would like to return during better weather. I walked around the Mackenzie Mountain Lookout, taking numerous pictures in all directions as it was truly a sight to behold. I didn't spend too much time here, so I headed back to my beast and continued driving south. Eventually, I knew that I had to use a washroom, so I took a detour to a trail called Le Battereau. There was no washroom here, but I hopped off to the side of the trail to take a piss. As I was pissing, a young couple pulled up and started hiking the trail. I was trying to make myself seem smaller, as I didn't want them to catch me urinating by the trailhead. Unfortunately, they saw me and they understood that I had to do what I had to do. Perhaps in my rush to relieve myself, I didn't consider that I should have gone deeper into the woods off trail, but it was far too late. After zipping up, I ran back to my beast and left in a rush. From there, I set a course to Walmart at Sydney River, a 2-hour drive away. As I left Cape Breton Highlands, surprisingly, the weather cleared up and turned out quite nice. I drove through a number of beautiful villages along the scenic drive. Margery Forks, Middle River, and then eventually Hunter's Mountain, before returning to Highway 105 where I was earlier during the day. Passing through the same route I passed earlier, I continued driving until I eventually reached the Walmart at Sydney River. I stopped by a KFC where I had internet access and booked a ferry to Port-au-Bas, Newfoundland. Despite it being a little late in the evening, I was wide awake. Everything today had been incredible. The Cape Breton Highlands National Park and Cape Breton in general was absolutely stunning. Words simply couldn't describe what an adventure I had today. This was truly a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. Never did I think that the unhappiness, misery, and anger that I had felt for so long would lead me to spontaneously drive across the country. In the beginning, I didn't even think that I would make it this far. I didn't know when I would turn around. I really didn't even fucking care. What was my goal anyways? I knew my goal was to make it as far as I could. Were there any side quests? Was there a deeper meaning to this? These were all questions I was pondering while sitting in KFC, eating horrible food while leeching on the free Wi-Fi. Eventually, I booked my planned ferry trip from Sydney to Port-au-Bas. It would be approximately 8 hours on the ferry. I was excited. Again, I was visiting a place I had never been to before, and I would be visiting the final of the 10 provinces. Newfoundland was waiting for me. I returned to my beast, parked in a secure spot, and set myself up to sleep for the night. It took me a while to fall asleep, as I was so damn excited about what lay in store. But eventually, my eyes shut with the dreams of tomorrow. Thank you for sharing in my experience. If you enjoyed my video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would truly appreciate you sharing my video on your social network as it helps my channel grow. Be sure to check my playlist to see different categories on my exciting adventures I'm sharing with the world. Life is an adventure. Let's share this experience together.